I'm Environment Canada meteorologist David Jones. This video is an updated summary of the weather conditions on the night the Queen of the North sank. There are some minor changes from a previous version. In his book about marine weather on the BC coast, Owen Lang notes that Wright Sound can be particularly bad because it has 5 channels leading into it, and there is a good chance that one of those channels will be experiencing strong winds no matter the weather. He also notes that the Sound can be wild with southeast winds. When a front passes, the seas steepen and become chaotic. The wind direction in coastal channels and inlets is determined by their orientation. The air moves up or down these 5 channels, blowing from the high pressure end toward the low pressure end. If there's no difference in pressure, there's no wind. Here's the weather map from 10 p.m. on March 21st. The yellow dot is Wright Sound. There's low pressure over the Pacific and high pressure over the northern prairies. Since air flows from high pressure toward low pressure, coastal BC was experiencing northeast winds or southeast winds in the more exposed outer coastal areas. This satellite image from midnight shows the storm moving onto the coast. The front is near Wright Sound. The 4 a.m. map from March 22nd shows the storm has moved inland and is now crossing the coast mountains. There aren't any weather stations in the Sound, but from the analysis, the satellite imagery, the stations upstream, and ship reports in the vicinity, it's apparent the front crossed Wright Sound near midnight. Here's the location of 2 important waterways, Grenville Channel and Union Passage. The observations from vessels nearby that night are as follows. At 11 p.m. and about 35 kilometers away, the Sir Wilfrid Laurier reported a single gust from the southeast to 30 knots. Just before midnight, the Queen of the North reported a gust from the west of 30 knots with rain. At roughly the same time, the Lone Star reported gusty northwest winds, 2 to 4 meter seas, and heavy rain. The Castle Lake reported southerly winds of 6 to 9 knots with a 1-foot chop. Just after midnight, the captain of the Lone Star, seeking shelter in the inlet west of Promise Island, described a push from the south of about 35 to 45 knots. Shortly after midnight, 2 individuals on the Queen of the North reported heavy rain and snow with a gust to 60 knots from the southwest in a squall. At 1 a.m., the Lone Star, now at the scene of the grounding, reported that winds and waves had diminished to southeast 5 to 10 knots and 1 meter. All of these observations demonstrate the wide variability of winds and weather characteristic of a fast-moving, short-lived weather system in the complex terrain of the BC coast. This graph comes from the private weather station of the Lightkeeper at Boat Bluff, about 80 kilometers south of Wright Sound. Winds peaked at 34 knots just after 11 p.m. The brief nature of the strong winds is evident on this graph, which shows a duration of less than 1 hour. In marine weather, a gale warning is issued when steady winds above 34 knots are expected. That night, a gale warning for southeast winds 30 to 40 knots was in effect for Hecate Strait. In summary, it appears the Queen of the North, while in transit through Grenville Channel, was sheltered from the gale-force southeast winds that were occurring in Wright Sound ahead of the front. By the time the ferry passed the gap created by Union Passage, gale-force westerly winds had developed. The front was sweeping through. The Lone Star report of a southerly push of 35 to 45 knots supports this sequence. By 1 p.m., it was over. Winds had eased to light. The burst of strong winds, or the squall, lasted less than 2 hours, perhaps less than 1 hour. The skipper of the Lone Star reported that it was short, brutal, and wild, and lasted no more than half an hour where he was. In the vicinity of the front, the wind is especially variable, with continuous peaks and lulls, both of which can be very brief. The report of 60 knots from the deck of the Queen of the North seems inconsistent with the history and character of this front as observed at other weather stations. However, this report may incorporate the speed of the ship, meaning that to obtain the actual speed of the wind, you'd need to subtract the speed of the ship. As well, wind speed increases rapidly from the sea surface to the upper deck of a vessel. It's not uncommon for BC Ferry's instantaneous gust reports to be much higher than nearby weather stations or buoys that are at or near the sea surface, and which report the steady wind. So, the anomalously high report of 60 knots might be explained by the forward speed of the ship, by the height of the observation, or by it being a measure of the instantaneous wind. Whatever the case, it's not representative of the general or steady state of the wind associated with this storm. The most likely scenario is this. Just prior to running aground on Gill Island, the Queen of the North briefly encountered gale force winds of 35 to perhaps 45 knots and seas of 2 to 4 meters in an area known to be treacherous when a front passes. I hope this video summary has clearly explained the weather story on the night the Queen of the North sank.